Have you ever worked a job where one customer held the power to ruin your entire day, maybe even your career? In the world of silver spoons and silk napkins, some people aren't just difficult, they are tyrants. This is the story of Genevieve Lancaster, a millionaire's wife whose favorite pastime was terrorizing the staff of the city's most exclusive restaurant. For years, she was an untouchable force of nature, a whispered horror story among waiters. But her reign of fear was built on a fragile foundation of secrets, and it was about to be shattered by the one person no one saw coming, a new waitress named Ava, who possessed a secret weapon more powerful than money, the truth. What happens when quiet observation meets loud arrogance? You're about to find out. Aurelia was not merely a restaurant, it was a sanctuary for the city's elite, a place where money and power came to dine in hushed, reverent tones. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scents of truffle oil, aged leather, and the ghost of 1,000 different perfumes. Sunlight filtered through crystalline windows, fell in soft, buttery shafts across tables draped in heavy Belgian linen. To work at Aurelia was to be a silent, invisible cog in a machine of flawless luxury. It was a high-stakes, high-reward position, but it came with its own specific brand of monster. Her name was Genevieve Lancaster. On Ava Peterson's first day, she learned the 3 cardinal rules of Aurelia. Rule 1. The customer is always right. Rule 2. The wealthier the customer, the more right they are. Rule 3. Genevieve Lancaster is more right than God, and you will forget rules 1 and 2 if she says so. This final unwritten rule was delivered to her by Leo, a waiter whose face was a permanent mask of weary resignation. He had the haunted eyes of a man who had seen too many good colleagues crumble. "Listen, kid," he said, polishing a wine glass until it squeaked in protest. They were standing in the service alcove, hidden from the patron's view. "You're sharp, you're quick, I see that. But none of it matters when table 7 arrives. That's her table, the Lancasters." Ava, meticulously straightening her simple black apron, kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Lancaster." Leo let out a short, bitter laugh. "You've heard of her then? Good. Don't make eye contact unless she addresses you. Don't speak unless spoken to. Anticipate everything, assume nothing. If she orders the sea base, make sure chef knows it's for her. He has a separate preparation process just for her table." "A separate process?" Ava asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is it an allergy? The only thing she's allergic to is happiness." Leo muttered, placing the glass back on the rack with surgical precision. "No, it's about control. She needs to know she can make the entire world bend to her whim. Last month, she made a new girl, Jessica, cry because the lemon wedge for her water had 2 seeds instead of 1. She claimed the excessive pip count was a sign of a careless kitchen and a collapsing society. Ava processed this. It sounded less like a difficult customer and more like a case study in clinical narcissism. In her previous life, before she needed this job to fund her younger brother's exorbitant tuition at a specialized arts academy, she'd been a research assistant for a psychology professor. She'd read volumes on personality disorders. Genevieve Lancaster sounded like a textbook case. "Jessica still works here?" Ava asked. "Barely." Leo sighed. Mr. Sterling, the manager, had to grovel for 20 minutes. He comped their $1,000 meal and sent a case of 20-year-old scotch to their penthouse. "The Lancasters spend more here in a month than you or I make in a year, so she gets what she wants." Ava's first 2 weeks were a blur of learning, a frantic dance of memorizing the wine list, the daily specials, and the peculiar habits of the regulars. She learned that Mr. Henderson at table 3 liked his steak charred on the outside and blue on the inside, a culinary monstrosity. She learned that Mrs. Davenport at table 9 would only drink water imported from a specific Fijian spring, and she could supposedly taste the difference. It was a world of performative wealth and endless demands, but Ava was a quick study. She was efficient, quiet, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear at a table the moment before a guest realized they needed something. Mr. Sterling was pleased. "You have a grace, Peterson," he'd told her. "You don't just serve, you glide." But she hadn't yet met the dragon of Aurelia. That changed on a crisp Tuesday evening. The restaurant was humming with its usual controlled energy when a hush seemed to fall over the front of the house. The hostess's smile became a tight, desperate rictus. Mr. Sterling, who was usually directing staff from the back, suddenly materialized at the entrance, his posture a study in deference. "The Lancasters," Leo whispered to Ava as they passed each other, a tray of cocktails in his hands. His knuckles were white. Ava finally saw her. Genevieve Lancaster was a woman sculpted from ice and steel. She was tall, impossibly thin, and dressed in a sheath of gray silk that probably cost more than Ava's car. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe chignon, accentuating sharp cheekbones and a mouth set in a line of perpetual disapproval. She radiated an aura of cold, immense power. Beside her, her husband Richard Lancaster, a titan of real estate, looked almost like an accessory, a well-tailored, handsome man whose own formidable presence was utterly eclipsed by his wife's. They were seated at table 7 in the restaurant's best spot, a secluded corner booth with a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was Jessica's section. Ava watched from a distance as the young waitress approached the table, her hands visibly trembling. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster." Jessica began, her voice a little too high. "May I start you with some water?" Genevieve snapped, her voice low but carrying like a whip crack. "Still, no ice, and a lemon wedge, 1 seed. I trust you can manage that simple task this time." Jessica blanched, the color draining from her face. "Yes, of course, Mrs. Lancaster." She scurried away, looking like a frightened rabbit. Ava felt a knot of something cold and unpleasant tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just rudeness. It was calculated cruelty. It was a performance designed to assert dominance from the first moment. The evening unfolded as a slow-motion catastrophe for Jessica. Genevieve sent back her appetizer, claiming the prosciutto was distressingly damp. She complained that the ambient music was a quarter-tone flat and was giving her a migraine. She interrogated Jessica on the precise origin of the olive oil, then scoffed at her answer. With each complaint, Jessica grew more flustered, her movements becoming clumsy, her words jumbled. The final act came with the main course. Genevieve had ordered a simple risotto, a dish notoriously difficult to perfect under pressure. She took one tiny, delicate bite, her face contorted into a mask of disgust. She placed her fork down with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence around the table. "Inedible," she declared, her voice resonating with theatrical sorrow. "Completely and utterly inedible. The rice is gummy. It tastes of despair. Richard, I think I'm losing my appetite." Mr. Sterling was at the table in seconds, his face a mask of practiced apology. Jessica stood behind him, tears welling in her eyes, her career at Aurelia flashing before them. Ava watched it all from her station across the room. She wasn't just watching the scene, she was studying it. She observed the way Genevieve never looked at her food when she complained, but instead watched the reactions of the staff. She saw the flicker of a smirk on her lips when Jessica started to cry. She noticed that Richard Lancaster never tasted the food his wife rejected. He simply sighed, pulled out his phone, and waited for the ordeal to be over. This wasn't about food. This was a game, and Genevieve Lancaster was the only one who enjoyed playing. At that moment, watching Jessica flee to the staff room in tears, Ava didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, clear surge of resolve. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she knew that she would not be one of this woman's victims. 2 weeks later, the inevitable happened. Leo came down with a sudden flu, and his sections had to be reassigned. Mr. Sterling approached Ava, his expression grim. "Peterson," he said, his voice low, "I need you on sections 4 and 5 tonight, and you're taking table 7. A collective silent inhale seemed to pass through the nearby staff. It was a death sentence. Ava simply nodded her face, betraying nothing. "Of course, Mr. Sterling." As she prepared the table, checking every fork for smudges, ensuring the salt and pepper shakers were filled to the exact same level, arranging the single rose in its bud vase so it faced northwest as per the restaurant's arcane design Bible, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Fear was a useless emotion in this context. What was required was data, observation, precision. She treated it not as a service, but as an experiment. The Lancasters arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. Ava watched Genevieve's entrance. The woman moved with the predatory grace of a panther, her eyes sweeping the room, assessing, judging, and dismissing everything they landed on. When they were seated, Ava waited precisely 45 seconds, the optimal time between seating and initial approach, according to Aurelia's training manual, and then moved toward the table. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster." She said, her voice even and calm. She did not gush, she did not grovel. She simply stated a fact. Genevieve's cold blue eyes flickered up, registering a new face. A flicker of something annoyance interest crossed her features. "You're new," she stated. It was not a question. "I am, ma'am. My name is Ava. I will be taking care of you this evening." Genevieve leaned back, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. "Let's hope you're more competent than the last one. The crying girl." Ava didn't take the bait. "May I get you started with a drink? Perhaps the Sancerre you enjoyed last time, Mrs. Lancaster." She had done her homework. She'd reviewed the Lancasters' order history for the past 6 months. Genevieve's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The move was unexpected. It was a move of competence, of preparation. It denied her an immediate opening to assert her superiority. "No," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm in the mood for something different. I want a cocktail. Something innovative. Surprise me. But be warned." She added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I detest anything overly sweet, anything with gin, and I find the taste of citrus to be terribly pedestrian." It was a classic trap. An impossible order designed to fail. If Ava brought something Genevieve didn't like, she was incompetent. If she asked for more clarification, she was unimaginative. Ava held her gaze for a beat. "I have just the thing in mind," she said smoothly. She turned to Richard Lancaster. "And for you, sir, your usual Macallan 18 neat." Richard, who had been staring blankly at the menu, looked up in surprise. "Oh, yes, thank you. Perfect." He seemed genuinely pleased to have been spared any effort. Ava retreated to the bar. She conferred quietly with the bartender, a grizzled artist named Owen. "Table 7, the impossible cocktail." Owen rolled his eyes. "What's the trap this time?" "No gin, no citrus, not sweet, but innovative." He thought for a moment, then a slow grin spread across his face. "I've got it. A smoke-infused vodka martini, very dry, with a muddled rosemary sprig and a single savory black olive. We'll use a hint of dry vermouth that's been infused with peppercorns. It's complex, herbaceous, and completely unexpected." "Perfect," Ava said. When she presented the drink, she did so with a quiet flourish. The cocktail was served in a chilled coupe glass, a fragrant wisp of applewood smoke still clinging to the rim. Genevieve stared at it, her expression unreadable. She lifted the glass, inhaled its aroma, and took a small, critical sip. A long silence stretched out. Ava stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't fidget. She didn't look anxious. She simply waited for the verdict. "It's adequate," Genevieve finally pronounced. It was the highest praise she was capable of giving. From the corner of her eye, Ava saw Mr. Sterling let out a breath he didn't seem to know he was holding. Round 1 to Ava. The rest of the meal was a relentless barrage of microaggressions and veiled challenges. Genevieve questioned the freshness of the scallops despite them having been delivered that morning. She claimed her water glass was not chilled to the optimal temperature, forcing Ava to replace it 3 times. She asked Ava to describe the flavor profile of a Malbec in excruciating detail, hoping to catch her in a lie or a moment of ignorance. Each time, Ava responded with unshakable, polite precision. She had tasted the wine with the sommelier that afternoon. She knew the scallops had arrived at 9:15 a.m. from the coastal fishery. She replaced the water glass without a hint of resentment, treating the request as perfectly reasonable. Her unflappable competence was beginning to have the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of placating Genevieve, it seemed to infuriate her. The woman was accustomed to reducing her servers to trembling wrecks. Ava's calm professionalism was a mirror reflecting Genevieve's own absurdity back at her. The more she pushed, the more ridiculous her demands seemed in the face of Ava's placid efficiency. The true test came with the main course. Genevieve had ordered the Dover sole, a notoriously delicate fish. Ava served it, placing the plate before her with a steady hand. Genevieve stared at it for a full minute. She picked up her fork, prodded a single flake of the fish, and then dropped the utensil onto her plate with a clatter. "There is a scent," she announced to her husband, though her words were aimed like daggers at Ava. "A faint, metallic odor. Like a riverbed. It's completely off-putting." Richard Lancaster, who had been happily eating his steak, sighed wearily. "Genevieve, it seems fine to me. Your palate has been dulled by years of whiskey and board meetings," she snapped. "Mine is more refined. Waitress," she said, her eyes locking onto Ava's. "Take this away. It's offensive." This was the moment every other server had broken. This was where apologies were supposed to flow, where managers were supposed to be summoned. Ava did not apologize. She simply looked at Genevieve with an expression of mild professional concern. "I am very sorry to hear that, ma'am," she said, her tone perfectly modulated. "The dish is prepared with a white wine and butter reduction. There should be no metallic notes. Is it possible you're detecting the minerality from the Chablis you're drinking? It often presents with notes of flint or wet stone, which some palates can interpret as metallic when paired with delicate fish." The table went silent. Ava had not accused her of being wrong. She had not been defensive. She had offered a plausible, expert-level explanation that subtly shifted the fault from the chef's incompetence to the diner's own sophisticated palate and wine pairing. It was a masterful move, turning Genevieve's own snobbery against her. Genevieve was momentarily stunned into silence. She had been outmaneuvered. To argue the point would be to admit she didn't understand the nuances of the very wine she had selected to demonstrate her superior taste. Her lips thinned into a bloodless line. "No," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "That is not it. The fish is off. Remove it." "Of course," Ava replied, her demeanor unchanged. She whisked the plate away without another word. She had lost the battle over the fish, but she had won something far more significant. She had shown Genevieve that she was not an easy target. She was not Jessica. She was not afraid. As Ava walked back to the kitchen, she could feel Genevieve Lancaster's eyes on her back, burning with a cold, new kind of fire. This was no longer just a game for Genevieve. It had become a war. The weeks that followed Ava's first encounter with Genevieve Lancaster settled into a tense rhythm. The Lancasters dined at Aurelia twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, and they always requested Ava's section. It was a clear declaration of intent. Genevieve was not going to let her defeat go unanswered. She was now actively hunting for a chink in Ava's armor. The attacks became more insidious, more psychological. She would change her order at the last possible second, a complex modification sent to the kitchen just as the original dish was being plated. She would ask Ava esoteric questions about art or history, trying to expose a gap in her knowledge and therefore her worthiness. On one occasion, she dropped her silk napkin on the floor and waited, watching to see how long it would take Ava to notice. Ava, who had seen the movement from the corner of her eye, appeared at her side with a fresh napkin in under 3 seconds. With each failed attempt, Genevieve's frustration grew coiling like a serpent within her. She started laying traps for Ava with the management. She would offer a backhanded compliment to Mr. Sterling loud enough for others to hear. "That new waitress, Ava," she'd say, her voice dripping with false magnanimity. "She's certainly efficient. Almost robotic, isn't she? One does wonder if she has any warmth in her at all. It can make the dining experience feel a bit sterile." Mr. Sterling, desperate to appease his most lucrative customer, would then have a quiet, awkward word with Ava. "Perhaps you could smile a bit more, Peterson. Try to connect with the guests." Ava would nod politely, promising to try, knowing full well that any attempt at warmth would be rebuffed by Genevieve as being overly familiar and unprofessional. It was a game she could not win by Genevieve's rules. So she continued to play by her own. Her defense was her almost obsessive attention to detail. But it was more than that. Ava was a watcher. She had always been one. She noticed things other people missed, the slight tremor in a person's hand when they lied, the way their eyes darted to an exit when they felt trapped. And she began to notice strange, specific things about Genevieve Lancaster. She noticed that Genevieve's complaints were never about quantifiable things. The steak was never undercooked. It had a dispiriting texture. The soup was never cold. It possessed a fundamental lack of soul. These were criticisms that could not be disproven. They existed only in her subjective experience. She also noticed a strange pattern related to Genevieve's expensive accessories. The woman was always adorned with a fortune in jewelry and carried handbags that were legendary in the fashion world. One evening she carried a rare Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag, a status symbol so potent it was practically a character in its own right. Genevieve placed it on the empty seat beside her with exaggerated care. Throughout the meal, her hand would often drift over to touch it, her fingers tracing the exotic leather. It was less like an accessory and more like a shield. Then came the incident with the wine. Genevieve had ordered a 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, a bottle that cost more than $4,000. The sommelier, a perpetually nervous man named Robert, presented it with the reverence due a holy relic. The decanting process was a piece of high theater. Genevieve swirled the deep red liquid in her glass, held it to the light, and inhaled its bouquet with a pained expression. "I'm getting wet cardboard," she announced, and a distinct note of stewed cabbage. Robert the sommelier looked as if he might faint. "Mrs. Lancaster, that's highly unlikely. This bottle has perfect provenance." "Are you calling me a liar?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. Richard Lancaster, for the first time, looked genuinely annoyed. "For God's sake, Genevieve, it's the best wine in the world. Just drink it." "It's corked," she insisted, pushing the glass away. "Tainted. I can't possibly drink it." The entire $4,000 bottle was a write-off. Mr. Sterling nearly had an aneurysm. But as Ava cleared the rejected full decanter from the table, she noticed something odd. Before the wine had been presented, while waiting for Robert to arrive, Genevieve had been reapplying her lipstick. She had a small bespoke leather case for it on the table. When she'd finished, she had snapped the case shut and run her thumb over the clasp, a small, nervous gesture. The lipstick case was sitting right beside her wine glass. Later that night, out of sheer curiosity, Ava looked up the brand of lipstick. It was an exclusive artisanal brand from France. She read through the description of the specific shade Genevieve wore. It was known for its unique organic formula, which included an unusual fixing agent derived from a specific type of moss. An agent known in rare cases to have a slightly earthy, almost fungal aroma that could be misinterpreted by a highly sensitive nose. A thread had appeared. A tiny, almost invisible loose thread in the magnificent, terrifying tapestry of Genevieve Lancaster. Ava felt a jolt of understanding. It was possible Genevieve wasn't just being malicious. It was possible she was wrong. Genuinely, demonstrably wrong. Her refined palate, might have been tricked by the scent of her own lipstick. And in her arrogance, she had mistaken her own error for a flaw in one of the world's finest wines. This realization changed everything. Genevieve wasn't an infallible goddess of taste and refinement. She was a human being fallible, and more importantly, deeply insecure. Her entire performance was a desperate attempt to prove her own superiority, because deep down she was terrified she didn't belong. The complaints weren't about the food. They were affirmations of her own perceived status. The Birkin bag wasn't an accessory. It was armor. Ava began to watch even more closely, not for attacks to defend against, but for more threads. She started a small notebook hidden in her locker. In it, she documented the Lancasters' visits. Tuesday, Oct. 3rd G complained of a chemical smell from the floral centerpiece. Noticed she was wearing a new, very strong perfume. Possible scent transference. Friday, Oct. 6th G claimed her veal was tough. Watched her cut it with a serrated steak knife instead of the proper veal knife, which would tear the delicate fibers. Tuesday, Oct. 10th G insisted the lighting above the table was flickering and giving her a headache. Observed her checking her phone under the table every 2 minutes. The bright screen in the dim light is a known cause of eye strain and headaches. The notebook grew. It was a catalog of self-inflicted wounds and misinterpreted sensations, all blamed on the restaurant and its staff. Ava realized she was looking at a woman trapped in a prison of her own, making a gilded cage of profound insecurity. And an insecure person, when cornered, doesn't retreat. They lash out. Ava knew a major confrontation was coming. Genevieve had to prove that she was the powerful one, and Ava was nothing. She just didn't know when the final battle would be. The storm broke on a Friday night in late October. The restaurant was packed the air electric, with the chatter of the city's most influential people. The Lancasters arrived, and Genevieve was wearing what could only be described as war paint. Her makeup was immaculate, her jewelry glittered with a hard, cold light, and she was dressed in a blood-red gown that made every other woman in the room look washed out. There was an air of finality about her, a sense that tonight a conclusion would be reached. Ava felt it the moment they sat down. The usual preliminary skirmishes were dispensed with. Genevieve was eerily quiet through the drink orders and the appetizers, her silence more menacing than any complaint. She was watching Ava with an unnerving, predatory focus, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment came with the main course. Genevieve had ordered the seared scallops with a saffron risotto. It was a signature dish, one the chef had perfected over a decade. Ava placed the plate before her, the golden risotto gleaming, the scallops seared to a perfect caramel brown. Genevieve did not pick up her fork. Instead, she stared at the plate. A slow, dramatic frown creased her brow. She brought a hand to her throat, her fingers fluttering delicately against her skin. "Oh my," she whispered, her voice suddenly frail. Richard Lancaster looked up from his phone, annoyed. "What is it now, Genevieve?" "My throat. It feels tight," she said, her voice growing hoarse. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. "And my skin, it's beginning to itch." She held out her pale forearm for her husband to inspect. "Right here." Richard squinted. "I don't see anything." "It's a tingling sensation," she insisted, her voice rising with manufactured panic. "It's the same reaction I have. Oh heavens, it couldn't be." She turned her wide, accusing eyes on Ava. "Waitress, come here." Ava stepped forward, her expression calm. "Yes, Mrs. Lancaster." "There are nuts in this dish, aren't there?" she demanded. "Pine nuts. I can smell them now. I have a severe, life-threatening allergy to pine nuts. It's on my file. You all know this." A hush fell over the surrounding tables. An allergy accusation was the nuclear option in the restaurant world. It was a charge of gross, potentially lethal negligence. Mr. Sterling was already sprinting from across the dining room, his face ashen. "Mrs. Lancaster, what's wrong?" Your new waitress is trying to kill me, Genevieve said, her voice filled with a tremor of what to the untrained ear might have sounded like genuine fear. She served me a dish with pine nuts. I am deathly allergic. There are no pine nuts in the risotto, Ava said, her voice steady and clear. The recipe uses toasted sunflower seeds for texture. Genevieve scoffed a theatrical, disbelieving sound. Don't lie to me, I know the reaction. My tongue is starting to swell. She began to breathe in short, shallow gasps, a masterful performance of anaphylaxis. Call an ambulance, Richard said, finally jolted into action, his voice laced with panic. There's no need for that, Ava said calmly, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria. Everyone stared at her. Mr. Sterling looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Peterson, what are you doing? The woman is having an allergic reaction. No, she isn't, Ava stated. It was a simple, confident statement of fact. Genevieve's eyes blazed with fury. Her feigned gasping momentarily ceased. How dare you, you incompetent little girl! You'll be fired for this. We will sue this restaurant into oblivion. Mr. Sterling grabbed Ava's arm. Peterson, that's enough. You're fired. Get your things and go. I am so sorry, Mrs. Lancaster. This is inexcusable. He was already in full damage control mode, bowing and scraping. But Ava didn't move. She stood her ground, her gaze locked on Genevieve. Mr. Sterling. Ava said, her voice firm. Before I go, may I ask Mrs. Lancaster one question? The manager looked flabbergasted, but the sheer force of Ava's composure held him in place. He gave a helpless, jerky nod. Ava's eyes never left Genevieve's. Mrs. Lancaster. She began, her tone polite, almost academic. You mentioned that your allergy is severe, life-threatening even. Of course it is, Genevieve rasped, resuming her performance. I need my EpiPen. Then I'm just a little confused. Ava continued, her voice perfectly even. Because the pesto you had with your bread service before the appetizers arrived contained pine nuts. Chef Antoine makes it in-house with a traditional recipe. You ate 3 pieces of bread with it. That was over 45 minutes ago. The air left the room. Genevieve's performance stopped, not gradually but instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. Her labored breathing ceased. The panic in her eyes was replaced by a cold, hard glare of pure hatred. She had walked right into a perfectly laid trap. Richard Lancaster's head snapped toward his wife. The pesto, is that true? Ava gestured to the nearly empty bowl still on the table. Pesto Genovese. The primary ingredients are basil, garlic, parmesan, olive oil, and pine nuts. It's the classic formulation. Mr. Sterling stared, his mouth agape. He remembered serving the bread himself. He had watched her slather the green paste onto the focaccia. The silence at the table was profound. The other diners, who had been watching with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity, were now utterly captivated. The script had been flipped. The waitress wasn't the villain, she was the inquisitor. Genevieve's face, which had been a mask of feigned agony, was now a canvas of raw, undiluted fury. She had been caught, not just in a lie, but in a malicious, calculated, and now utterly foolish-looking one. Her attempt to deliver the final killing blow had backfired spectacularly, exposing her as a fraud in front of her husband, the restaurant staff, and a dozen of her peers. This is... she stammered, searching for a way out, an explanation. But there was none. Ava wasn't finished. The tingling sensation on your arm, she said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying the weight of absolute authority. Could it possibly be from the new cashmere shawl you're wearing? Untreated cashmere can sometimes cause mild contact dermatitis on sensitive skin, especially when it's new. She delivered the line not as an accusation, but as a helpful suggestion. It was a poisoned compliment, a final devastating twist of the knife that was both utterly professional and deeply humiliating. She had not only exposed Genevieve's lie about the allergy, she had also provided a perfectly logical, non-malicious explanation for her symptoms, making her look not only like a liar, but a fool. The dragon had been cornered, and for the first time in anyone's memory, she had no fire left to breathe. The atmosphere at table 7 was no longer just tense. It was a vacuum from which all warmth and pretense had been sucked. Mr. Sterling stood frozen, his mind struggling to recalibrate the entire power dynamic he had obeyed for years. Richard Lancaster was staring at his wife, a dawning look of comprehension and deep embarrassment on his face. He was a man who prized control and reputation above all else, and he was beginning to understand the extent to which his wife's antics had made a public spectacle of them. Genevieve Lancaster, however, was not a woman who conceded defeat. Cornered animals are at their most dangerous. She drew herself up, her feigned illness, shed like a snake's skin, replaced by an armor of pure rage. "This is an outrage," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She pointed a trembling finger at Ava. "This waitress with her little observations has deliberately orchestrated this scene to humiliate me. She has a vendetta. She probably spit in my food." It was a desperate, ugly accusation, the last resort of a bully who has lost control of the narrative. Mr. Sterling flinched. "Mrs. Lancaster, I assure you, my staff would never—" "I don't care what you assure me of," she cut him off. "I am the customer. My experience has been ruined. My health was put at risk by your staff's ignorance, and now my character is being assassinated by this nobody." But Ava did not flinch. The chess match was not over. Genevieve had made a wild emotional move. Ava's response would be calm and logical. "My only intention, ma'am, was to prevent a respected guest from enduring an unnecessary and frightening trip to the hospital," Ava said, her tone still impeccably professional. She then turned her gaze slightly to address Richard Lancaster as well, subtly including him in the conversation and isolating his wife. "Once I realized your allergy couldn't have been triggered by the risotto, as you had already consumed the pesto without issue, my primary concern was to de-escalate the situation." Her choice of words was brilliant. "Once I realized." It framed her contradiction not as an attack, but as a logical deduction made in Genevieve's best interest. She was no longer the accused. She was the problem solver. Richard rubbed his temples, his face a mask of weary frustration. "Genevieve, the girl has a point. You ate the pesto. I saw you. You said you loved it." I must have been mistaken." Genevieve stammered, her argument crumbling. "It must be a different allergy. A delayed reaction. Shellfish, perhaps." "You had the scallop," Ava interjected gently. "But you've ordered the scallops on 6 previous occasions according to your reservation history. It seems unlikely you would have developed a sudden violent allergy to a food you regularly enjoy." Every word was a check. Every fact was a move that boxed the queen further into her corner. Ava was not using opinions or emotions. She was using Genevieve's own history, her own choices as weapons against her. The notebook in her locker had been a training manual, and she had memorized every page. Genevieve's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally and escape route. But all she saw were curious, judgmental stares. The other patrons were no longer pretending not to listen. This was the best show in town. The invincible Mrs. Lancaster, the terror of Aurelia, was being calmly and systematically dismantled by a waitress. "This is not about allergies, is it?" Richard Lancaster said, his voice quiet and heavy. He wasn't looking at Ava. He was looking at his wife, and for the first time he seemed to be truly seeing her. Seeing the insecurity, the desperate need for drama, the hollowness at the core of her imperious behavior. "Don't be ridiculous, Richard," she snapped, but the denial was weak, brittle. "No, I think I'm finally starting to understand." He continued, a grim finality in his tone. "The complaints, the scenes, it's all just this." He gestured vaguely at the mess of their public humiliation. "A performance." Genevieve finally broke her gaze away from Ava and stared at her husband, her expression one of utter betrayal. In her worldview, he was supposed to be her ultimate weapon, the power she could invoke to smite anyone who defied her. Instead, He was siding with the waitress. She decided to play her final trump card. Power. Raw financial power. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You want to side with her. You want to believe this conniving little servant over your own wife. Then this is the last dollar you will ever see from us. We will take our business elsewhere. I will make it my personal mission to tell everyone we know that Aurelia has gone to ruin, that its staff is impertinent and its food is questionable. I will destroy this restaurant's reputation." She stood up, grabbing her purse from the seat beside her. "We are leaving." It was a powerful threat. The Lancasters were more than just customers. They were influencers, the center of a social and financial ecosystem. Losing them and suffering their scorn could be a devastating blow to Aurelia. Mr. Sterling paled, his resolve wavering. He opened his mouth perhaps to offer one last groveling apology. But Ava made her final move. It was quiet, subtle, and aimed not at the room, but at the very heart of Genevieve's deepest, most hidden fear. As Genevieve stood clutching her expensive handbag like a life raft, Ava took a small step forward. Her voice when she spoke was so quiet that only those at the table could hear it. The theatricality was over. This final blow would be intimate, precise, and utterly devastating. "That's a beautiful bag, Mrs. Lancaster." Ava said, her eyes fixed on the gleaming crocodile leather. Genevieve was taken aback. She paused, her hand tightening on the handle. A compliment now. Was this some bizarre attempt at appeasement? "It's a Birkin," she said, the name dropping from her lips like a diamond. "Obviously. Of course." Ava agreed, her expression one of genuine admiration. "The craftsmanship is remarkable. It's fascinating, really." She leaned in just a fraction, as if sharing a secret. "My aunt, she works for an auction house. She's a specialist in authenticating luxury leather goods. She taught me to look at the little things. The details are everything she says." A strange stillness came over Genevieve. The color began to drain from her face, leaving behind a chalky pale mask. Ava continued, her voice a soft, devastating murmur. "She always told me, look at the stitching. On a real Birkin, the stitches are hand-done by a single artisan. They're tight, but they have a slight natural angle. They're never perfectly mechanically straight. And the hardware, the stamp on the clasp, has to be perfectly crisp. Even the slightest blur is a giveaway." Ava's eyes flickered from the bag up to Genevieve's face. She didn't need to say another word. She didn't need to say the word fake. She didn't need to call her a fraud. The implication hung in the air, heavier and more damning than any public accusation. In that one quiet moment, Ava had bypassed the superficial drama of allergies and bad service and struck directly at the core of Genevieve Lancaster's entire identity. The woman had built a fortress of superiority around herself, brick by expensive brick. Her power came from the perception that she was a member of an untouchable class, a person of such exquisite taste and immense wealth that she was beyond reproach. And the bag, that six-figure symbol of ultimate status, was a lie. It was a high-quality replica, no doubt, a super fake that would fool 99% of the population. But Ava, with her invented aunt, had just revealed herself to be in the 1% who would know. She had shown Genevieve that her deepest, most shameful secret, the possibility that she was not quite the aristocrat she pretended to be, that she was faking it, was visible. The entire edifice of Genevieve's persona crumbled into dust. The allergy, the complaints about the food, the snobbery. It was all a desperate overcompensation for this fundamental insecurity. She wasn't an arbiter of taste. She was a terrified impostor, and this quiet, unassuming waitress had just seen through her entire charade. Richard Lancaster, who had overheard Ava's soft-spoken words, glanced at the handbag and then at his wife's ashen face. A flicker of something pity-disgust crossed his features. He finally understood. It wasn't about the money. They had plenty of money. It was about a desperate, pathetic need to feel like she belonged to a world she secretly feared she was only visiting. Genevieve stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The rage was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. She had been seen, truly and completely seen. The humiliation was 1,000 times worse than being caught in a simple lie about pine nuts. This was a soul-deep exposure. Without another word, she turned and fled. She didn't stride out of the restaurant. She scrambled a clumsy, desperate escape, pushing past the hostess stand and bursting out into the cool night air. Richard Lancaster remained at the table for a moment longer. He looked at the chaos, the half-eaten meals, the overturned napkin, the ghost of his wife's presence. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was utterly speechless. Then he looked at Ava. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a black leather wallet, and placed several $100 bills on the table, more than enough to cover the meal and a generous tip. "I am sorry." He said the words, sounding foreign on his tongue. He didn't elaborate on what he was sorry for. The food, his wife, the last decade of his life, it could have been any of them. Then he too turned and walked out of the restaurant, his shoulders slumped, looking like a king whose kingdom had just been revealed to be made of cardboard. Checkmate. In the wake of the Lancasters' departure, a strange and profound silence descended upon Aurelia's dining room. The patrons who had witnessed the drama slowly returned to their own conversations, but the energy in the room had irrevocably shifted. It was as if a long, oppressive storm had finally broken, leaving behind a clean, clear, and slightly bewildering calm. Mr. Sterling walked over to table 7 and stared at the money Richard Lancaster had left. He touched one of the bills as if to confirm it was real. He then looked up at Ava, his expression a complex mixture of awe, terror, and profound respect. He had been prepared to fire her, to sacrifice her, to appease the dragon. Instead, she had not only slain the dragon, but had also revealed it to be a paper tiger. "Peterson," he began, his voice hoarse. I owe you an apology. I was about to let you go. I was wrong." Ava simply gave a small, tired nod. "You were doing what you thought was best for the restaurant, Mr. Sterling." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet statement of fact. Her victory didn't require his subjugation, only his understanding. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I was being a coward. You showed more integrity in the last 10 minutes than I have in the last 5 years of dealing with them." He gestured toward the door through which the Lancasters had vanished. From across the room, Leo caught Ava's eye. He slowly and deliberately raised his water pitcher in a silent, respectful toast. Jessica, who had been hiding in the service station, peeked out a look of stunned disbelief and dawning admiration on her face. In one evening, Ava had transformed from the new girl into a legend. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't been rude. She hadn't broken a single rule of service. She had won by being smarter, calmer, and more observant than her opponent. She had weaponized the truth. The story of that night spread through the city's service industry like wildfire. The tale of how the dragon of Aurelia was felled by a quiet waitress became a piece of modern folklore, a source of hope for beleaguered servers everywhere. The Lancasters were never seen at Aurelia again. Rumor had it, they took a long, extended trip to Europe, and when they returned, they were rarely seen dining out at all. Genevieve's power, which had been built on the fragile foundation of fear and perceived status, had evaporated the moment her deepest insecurity was exposed. Without her audience of terrorized staff, her performance had no meaning. Aurelia changed too. A subtle but significant shift occurred in the restaurant's culture. Mr. Sterling began to stand up for his staff, more realizing that true luxury wasn't about bowing to every whim of the wealthy, but about maintaining a standard of dignity and respect for everyone under his roof. The fear that had permeated the air was replaced by a new sense of pride and camaraderie. And Ava Peterson. She kept her job. She needed the money for her brother's tuition, and she was exceptionally good at what she did. She continued to glide through the dining room, a model of quiet efficiency and grace. She treated every guest with the same calm, professional respect, whether they were a hedge fund billionaire or a young couple celebrating an anniversary. To the new hires, she was a figure of quiet authority. They were told her story in hushed, reverent tones. But Ava never spoke of it. She had no interest in being a hero. She had not set out to start a revolution. She had simply refused to be a victim. She had refused to let her dignity be stripped away by a cruel and unhappy woman. Sometimes, as she set a table, meticulously aligning the silverware and polishing a wine glass until it shone, she would think of Genevieve Lancaster. She felt no lingering anger, only a faint professional pity. She had learned that true power isn't about how loudly you can roar or how much money you can throw around. It's about knowing who you are, standing your ground, and having the courage to see the world and the people in it exactly as they are. And in the quiet, elegant world of Aurelia, that was a lesson more valuable than any vintage wine or rare truffle on the menu. And so the reign of the millionaire's wife came to a quiet, unceremonious end. It wasn't a loud battle that defeated her, but a quiet truth delivered by a waitress who understood that real strength isn't about intimidation, but observation. Ava's story is a powerful reminder that bullies, no matter how rich or powerful, often stand on the shakiest of foundations. It shows us that dignity is not something that can be taken from you unless you allow it to be. If this story of quiet courage and poetic justice resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories where the underdog doesn't just get a chance, they change the entire game. Thanks for listening.